give a short presentation today, which is hopefully going to try and summarize some work that is ongoing. I'm doing this work with Ian Shuttleworth in Belfast, Queen's University of Belfast. And it's a paper in the way to hopefully an advanced draft, though I'm still doing interviews and hopefully additional focus groups to try and get some more insights into what I think has been quite an exciting time in terms of civil society and the participation of local groups and forms of activism at the local level in different communities, but in particular looking at Republican Irish communities in Northern Ireland at a time of the global pandemic. And I've got a very basic outline to the presentation. I'm just going to try and introduce some really basic core concepts at the start that have been important in kind of framing my thinking on this. And I'm then going to spend a little bit of time explaining the country and the case study before I think this discussion and conclusion is going to be a sort of similar discussion point at the end of this. So my interest in looking at COVID-19 and the way that this was kind of policed and the state measures were sort of mediated in the case of Northern Ireland really came about on the back of kind of long-standing interest that I have in regulation school thinking and regulation theory, French-inspired regulation theory, because I've always been quite interested in this sense that there are kind of high level kind of strategies and thoughts in place trying to regulate capitalism and the sort of crisis tendencies of capitalism, and in particular looking at the regulation school to try and summarize and explain in a kind of top-down fashion how capitalism seems to continue on its march despite crisis tendencies, and looking at this sort of period, these latter two bullet points here, the kind of period from the kind of post-World War II up to the end of the 60s, this sort of Fordist Keynesian period in which we had sustained economic growth, in which there was a kind of coherent regime of accumulation, a dominant mode of economic growth and distribution, which was combined with a mode of social regulation. And I think that's one of the key features of regulation school thinking, that it's one thing for the state to try and play a role supporting capital, supporting the growth of firms and profitable development in the economy, but there also has to be this sense of a kind of social regulation mechanisms. And Fordism was accompanied, as we know, by these sort of Keynesian institutions, wider macroeconomic policies, which allowed for a period of relative harmony between labour and capital, a strong role for the welfare state, strong role with unions and collective bargaining and creating this kind of relative period of harmony, which broke down in the 1970s when profits started to fall. And what we've seen since the 1970s, marked in particular by regimes in the United States and the UK under Reagan and Thatcher, this now widespread understanding of a kind of turn to neoliberal policies, attacks on organised labour, austerity, and an emphasis on putting pressure on workers with low wages and insecurity and so on. So this has spurred a lot of thinking about whether or not this is sustainable. A lot of debates around the time. I'm thinking about the 1990s in particular, with this argument that we've moved into the kind of post-Fordist era, flexible accumulation, and a lot of emphasis on what are the new kind of forms of accumulation, but less understanding of what are the dominant modes of social regulation in this period, which we, if we're going to call it neoliberalism, what's going on to try and sustain people, sustain communities, and how does the system as we know it carry on? And I was interested in regulation theory in terms of how it might explain crisis tendencies such as what we've seen with the pandemic, and in particular some of these, what I saw as the COVID-19 crisis reports at the time, really coming in the face of what we'd seen with neoliberalism, and suddenly this long-standing trend of attacks on the welfare state was having to be reversed. We saw this returns of kind of Keynesian policies in a bid to try and sustain the economy, put a freeze on the crisis that was happening, and trying to keep places and communities intact, with this idea that the economy was going to open up again after the lockdown and after the pandemic, and all the state interventions which had to happen at that time. So we're talking about public health interventions, obviously in the form of lockdowns, furlough job retention schemes across Europe. In the UK, estimated 11.7 million jobs furloughed via a scheme at the cost of 70 billion. But we also saw other schemes coming in, the state kind of intervening in a way that it hadn't previously done, putting a ban on rent, punitive rent sanctions, evictions, etc. at the local level, and also a range of support schemes. So in Northern Ireland, these were the key schemes: the localised restrictions support scheme and the COVID restrictions business support scheme, and various grants, loans, tax cuts, etc. to try and rejuvenate the economy at the time of the crisis. Now, what I was interested in from this perspective was really looking at the kind of local level at which this is mediated, and drawing on regulation theory, but trying to look at this in a more localized, place-based context. So very, very geography infused, obviously. And I was drawing on Andrew Jonas's concept of a local labour control regime within this, where he basically argues that you have to localize this regulation framework, and what I think is really interesting about Jonas's concept is this really deliberate sense of trying to acknowledge that you need to have the linkages between these spheres. So he breaks the spheres down into the spheres of production, so workplace politics, the need for training, surveillance of workers, wages and benefits, etc. But he also argues that there has to be links between the sphere of reproduction, so you need to train people, you need to educate people, schools and so on, and the linked sphere of consumption, so housing, recreation, consumption generally. All of this takes place at a very local level, is Jonas's argument, and this was really my interest in the case study. What I was really interested in was looking at how this new sort of marked state intervention to try and mitigate the COVID-19 crisis was actually mediated at a very local level, how that actually worked, and to really try and critique some of the regulation school thinking from the perspective that this is very abstract stuff. It's looking at institutions in a very top-down way, and trying to look at the way in which the state kind of orchestrates some of these crisis support policies. And what I was interested in was looking at whether or not, at a very local level, how local groups try and mediate and interact with these state interventions, and whether or not there are any bottom-up policies or solutions that are happening, driven by workers and communities and the institutions that have been long-standing within place. And part of my interest in this was spurred as well by debates on resilience and resourcefulness literature. So de Vutteriel went through a number of articles where he basically argued that resilience was still a really useful term. It's come under a lot of criticism. There was a sense that resilience was not a positive word because it was effectively sustaining difficult conditions. It was a kind of concept which was used to describe how people carry on and persevere despite difficult structural constraints. And the author argued that this was harsh, and that resilience forms of coping were actually quite often a precursor for kind of more transformative acts down the line. McKinnon and Derrickson, on the other hand, they've sought to contest this term resilience. They do see it in a kind of more negative sense of not being very transformative. And they urge more engagement with this term resourcefulness, which they see as a qualitatively distinct, more capable set of actions for challenging inequalities in resource distribution. And their study of resourcefulness also includes a focus on kind of locally embedded resources, skill sets, technical knowledge, and the role of what they call indigenous folk knowledge as being key to delivering transformative actions. So, as I said, I sought to apply this thinking to Northern Ireland, which I see as a very distinct place. And, just as a very sort of brief historical overview of Northern Ireland, this is a very contested place. when we're talking about the role of the state, this is not straightforward in Northern Ireland. Quite separate from Brexit, the entire evolution of Northern Ireland is made for quite troubling aspects when it comes to state intervention and the direction of travel when it comes to policies. So Northern Ireland was created through partition in 1921, and it's a very quick history of it. It went through a period of direct rule from Westminster in Britain from 72 to 98. The period from 1960s to 1990s, this was marked by tremendous conflict. The definition of this conflict itself is very contested, but the period is known as the Troubles, and this really came on the back of what was perceived to be incredibly just fraught relations between two communities, but in particular this Irish community suffering tremendously from discrimination and worklessness and deprivation and so on. And this is a period of incredible turmoil in Northern Ireland, which is seen to have reached a kind of peaceful compromise through the Good Friday Agreement of 1999, which put in place a Northern Ireland executive, a shared government under the system of consocialisation. So what we have in Northern Ireland is this system where you have a first and a deputy first minister who tend to come from contrasting backgrounds. Northern Ireland, as a devolved space of the UK, has control over health, education, roads and housing, but it's reliant on funding for these functions from the Burnett formula and from Westminster. So this is relevant in the context of COVID-19. Also relevant is the kind of legacy effects of this state space and its evolution. Northern Ireland is not a very functional political space. Even the government since Northern Ireland Executive was created, it's marked by continual breakdowns, continual stalemates, not a lot of functionality. And throughout its history, Northern Ireland has maintained a large number of unelected administrative units, and civil society and voluntary organisations have played an incredibly important role in the functioning and coherence of the space. So there's a historic role of unelected administrative units, more than 6,000 organisations registered as voluntary, community and social enterprise sector as we speak, and a wealth of social capital, which was relevant for me here. This was in particular in some of the most deprived, and in particular Irish areas marked by republicanism, a huge concentration of quite forthright religious and civil society organisations which built up since the 1960s to try and sustain local populations. So I was interested in this from the point of view of the challenges and legacy effects of the evolution of these structures, these bottom-up structures, which I argue interact with a lot of the governance layers and reforms, including in the case of trying to manage the COVID-19 crisis. So the research focused in on a particular part of Belfast for the purposes of this paper, and it's this area here. It's the Upper Springfield / White Rock area, which is one of the more deprived areas of Northern Ireland and Belfast. Covers around 11,000 residents. 46% of working age population are employed deprived, i.e. they want to work but they're unable to do so. Large portion of job seekers and long-term unemployed. High rates of crime, drug violence, and offences, and generally this is a very poor area that has historically been very poor. And I've taken around a dozen interviews in a focus group with different groups here for the purposes of this discussion. So the case study area in West Belfast, what was particularly interesting about this area is the sort of rich density of the networks that were pre-existing at the time of COVID-19. When COVID-19 first broke, there were particular organisations such as the Springfield Community House, the Glen Community Parent Youth Group, and in particular the Upper Springfield Development Trust, which came into being in decades preceding the COVID pandemic. But in particular, the Springfield Community House was the legacy of Father Desmond Wilson, who had put in place a system of community representation and sought to connect an existing network of religious and voluntary and community support networks. This stems very much from the Troubles, and reflected basically when COVID-19 broke, when the pandemic broke, Father Desmond Wilson and other activists at this time had already put in place a system of 5 minutes left.
5 minutes.
Okay, of community groups which were apt to kind of spring into life at the time of the pandemic. And in particular, this was evidenced through the creation of a group called Arskara Kayla, which essentially dovetailed from an existing organization. This translates as the Festival of Bluebells. Basically, as one interviewee said, a loose brand, an organic coming together of activists from different backgrounds. And the group used, the group was essentially, it included younger and older people, but in particular, it had a lot of activists who were very good at social media and very good at communicating to local populations, in addition to sort of building on the legacy of older members and in the spirit of Father Desmond Wilson and other long-standing kind of heroic activists from the Troubles period. And you know, this sort of summed up there's a sort of question when the pandemic broke: how was this group going to interact with what was top-down state instructions, in particular from the Tory government in Britain, and you know, the opening discussion they had was that these communities have never acknowledged, probably not to this day, that the UK government has any say in their lives. I mean, I'm not even joking about that. I think it's just the nature of us to query things always twice ourselves. There's a healthy skepticism. I'm not saying it's being a bad citizen, it's probably being a good citizen to always use your own judgment. So there was this sense straight away that there was always this question: were they going to adhere to the rules that were coming down from Westminster when it came to the pandemic? And straight away, a lot of kind of autonomy coming through. There was this sense that the people within the group had spent a long time protesting against governance from the UK and whether or not they were going to adhere to instructions that were given to them. Now, the creation of Arskara Kayla allowed certain activists in the group to actually be very proactive. So they were calling out the health minister on this. They were calling out the Department for Communities, saying what had to be done. They were mobilizing sort of historical knowledge and spreading a lot of messages to the community through social media. So they were, as I'll show, they were helping with lockdowns, they were helping with public health instructions and so on, but they were doing this in a very kind of autonomous way, celebrating Irish culture, language, and republicanism. They were invoking language of Republican heroes such as Bobby Sands, saying everyone has their own particular part to play. They were actually, you know, when it came to people trying to cope with lockdown, they weren't just issuing kind of generic public health advice. They were putting out videos of ex-political prisoners and getting them to give their testimonies about how they coped in isolation. So a very kind of Republican infused coping process that they were encouraging. But they did very much promote the lockdowns that the government was issuing. In fact, that they saw this was initially articulated as a kind of a rebellion. They argued that they were actually trying to shut down the economy and encourage lockdowns before Westminster dictated this. And straight away, they were trying to mobilize their existing network to meet food parcel supply demands, utilizing a rent association that the trust had previously set up. They were putting out notices, they were knocking on doors, they were exchanging numbers, etc., to try and get people to avail of their services. And they were also contesting the Department for Communities, who were using a more national level charity, the Red Cross, to deliver supplies to people. They intervened with this, they lobbied, they managed to secure a stronger role for their local groups in administering supports, and encouraged the Department for Communities to come up with a new action plan, which enhanced coordination between city councils and community groups and gave a stronger role for their local groups. I'm going to try and go quite quickly through the remaining slides. The other things they were doing, again, they're really, really strongly engaging with social media here. They've got kind of motivating, stimulating activities that they're doing, things for kids. They've got lots of online resources. They're mobilizing street bingo competitions and doing a lot of public displays, a lot of videos, a lot of murals and so on. And some of these gaining national attention across the UK. And this was quite interesting from a kind of Republican point of view. This was this kind of clash between being very anti-British, but at the same time, at the time of the pandemic, really celebrating and endorsing the kind of hallmark of a British institution in the NHS. And just to kind of rush through and conclude a little bit, my argument here, I think, is that the group did play a role in kind of administering and supporting the state instruction to have lockdowns and supporting local communities to try and cope and adhere during this crisis. But what they also did was they felt that this kind of coping period was laying the kind of foundations for what would be more radical politics in the future. One activist in Oscar Akela argued that what they'd seen was a far more kind of stronger sense of togetherness that hadn't existed since the Troubles. They'd argued that this had really brought people together in kind of Irish community sort of sense, and in a very localized way of coping, almost in at odds with the existing mainstream. And they evidenced this partially through an emerging, what they call the skills bank that was emerging. So one person argued that the joiner that lives 2 doors up the road, he put my office together for me. He wouldn't take any money off me. He was going, so you've been doing the fitness classes, you've been organising the bingo, this is something I can do back for you. And it's almost like a banking of skills was happening without anybody planning it. And it was also the sense that they were arguing that this togetherness was going to carry on, it was going to form sort of future platforms for resistance against the state, and it had shown that the community could cope as a kind of coherent whole on its own, and almost giving also a sense that through this kind of activism that was taking place, that they would push for new, more progressive forms of urban regeneration, that they'd kind of seen that while you can take support from the state, you can also lobby and campaign against it with a view to trying to shift the political direction going forward. So I'll finish there, because I know we started slightly later, probably ran over slightly, so I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. So now we have to do the transition to the new presentation. Lisa Suckert.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. In my presentation, which is entirely theoretical and conceptual presentation, I want to start from a phenomena that at first seems rather negative and rather detached from possibilities that we're talking about, and that is crisis. And I think, I'm sorry, I need to get something to drink first. But in the meantime, maybe you have time to look at these pictures. And I think that these pictures show that, you know, one can hardly deny that we are experiencing crisis as really a part of our current social reality. So after an era of relative stability, at least in the global north, we are witnessing basically 2 decades of crisis. And it's clear that sociologists need to engage with the phenomenon of crisis. And I would argue they have always, of course, done so. I mean, you can see that already in classical sociology, but what I'm showing you here is sociological articles that refer to crisis in their title or abstract since the 1970s, and in absolute and relative numbers. You can see that there is particularly, of course, since 2018 and the financial crisis, there is really revived interest in the concept and the empirical phenomenon of crisis. So there are, of course, a plethora of approaches and definitions to crisis, but I see currently 2 major perspectives on crisis that are important for me today. So the first one sees crisis more as some kind of tipping points. So here crises are events or episodes that are decisive. So very close to the original medical sense of the word crisis, crisis is seen as a critical moment that requires treatment. So there is some kind of urgency, if you like. But these are moments that can either lead to death, like in this picture, or with the right treatment, the situations can lead to recovery. So crises are in this perspective disruptive moments, but they can also be new beginnings. They can be the opportunity for change and bringing about alternative futures. But then there is a second perspective on crisis that we see in the literature, and that is currently gaining traction as well. And here crises are seen as persisting conditions. So crises do not go away, but rather they transform from one crisis to the next, from economic to political to social crisis, for example. They broaden, they deepen, and we see prolonging crisis. So here we see some kind of normalization of crisis, while at the same time, norms are continuously suspended. So in this perspective of crisis, there is not really a recovery. And this situation, of course, comes very close to what sociologists have framed as enemy. And I'm coming back to that later. So the crucial question for me is, under what conditions do crises serve as some kind of tipping points that can lead to recovery? And under what conditions do they become persisting conditions and recovery is taken off the agenda? Now, I cannot answer this question, of course, in this talk, but I would suggest that it is helpful to reconsider crisis from the perspective of imagined futures to address this very question. Now, I will not go into too much detail what I consider to be an imagined future perspectives of sociology. I mean, as a matter of fact, as some of you might know, I've written together with Jens a paper on this future as a social fact, and another paper is forthcoming in the European Journal of Sociology. And the essence is that I consider the sociology of imagined futures to be something, a wide array of sociological research that considers perceptions of the future, how people think of and narrate the future, make sense of the future as its object of investigation. So as an element that needs to be considered to make sense of social reality in the present. And I would argue that focusing on imagined futures brings a new and promising perspective to the study, to the sociological study of crisis. And to do so, I would like to focus on a very specific kind of imagining the future, which is collective projecting. And collective projecting has basically two elements. The first one is that imagined futures can vary according to the level of collectiveness. So here, very briefly, I distinguish three levels. On the lowest level, we have individual aspirations. So these are imagined futures by an individual about the individual's future. Then on the next level, we have social expectations. So these are held by a collective, but about the future of an individual. And on the highest level, we have collective futures, which I'm interested in. So these are futures that are held by a collective, and they are about the future of the collective. And these kind of collective futures exist in all societies, but they come about in very different forms. So these can be utopias, predictions, scenarios, hopes, goals, ideologies, religious futures. And they are important because they orient both social expectations and individual aspirations. Of course, not in a deterministic way, but they can orient them. So they orient the way that societies make sense of their future. And so I'm interested in collective futures, but again, in a specific mode of collective futures. And that is projecting. And projecting, I consider as a specific instrumental mode of imagining the future. So it means perceiving the future as means-ends relation, and I would argue as agentic means-ends relation. And here, of course, I draw on Alfred Schütz's work and also on the work that Anne has done on the issue of projecting. So for Schütz, projecting basically requires that you imagine a future state of the world that is desirable or repellent. And then from this imagined future, you then in some kind of exercise of anticipating retrospective or something like that, you go back and imagine the steps that lead up to this future or that are necessary to avoid this future. So it is clearly imagining the future in the sense of means and ends. But of course, these, for Schütz, these are not ultimate ends or objective ends or something like, the rational choice version of ends. But these are, of course, constructed ends and contingent ends that are means and ends that can be part of larger means ends trajectories and so on. So to give you an idea what would be such a collective projection, for example, is that trading with Russia can secure peace and prosperity in Europe. So there's a clean end, so we want to have a prosperous and peaceful future in Europe. And then there's the means, trading, having good trade relations with Russia. So this would be a collective projection. And I would argue that this kind of instrumentally making sense of collective future is crucial for current societies, for modernity, if you like to. And but what is more, I think it's also important to make sense of crisis, or it can help us to understand what happens in moments of crisis. Because what I would suggest is to consider crisis as moments when the future becomes radically uncertain. So as a moment when collective projections basically break down and means and relations are disentangled. Now, when I say crises are episodes of radical uncertainty about the future, this basically applies to two levels of uncertainty. Now, the first I call ontological uncertainty of the future. And that means that previous expectations about what will be are made redundant. So plans, schedules, and so forth, they do not apply anymore. The future cannot unfold as it was intended. And I think after 2.5 years of COVID, we all know what that exactly means. But there is a second level of uncertainty involved when we talk about crisis, and that's what I call epistemological uncertainty. So it's not only that, the plans that we had cannot unfold, but it's also hard to form new expectations when one is experiencing an episode of crisis. So the grammar underlying these projections, the means-ends relations, are broken. And this applies both to causality and agency. You could, for example, say that, in this geopolitical crisis we're having right now, this projection that I've just presented to you, having good trade relations with Russia will ensure peace and prosperity in Europe, is broken. The causality does not make so much sense anymore. We don't even know how we can achieve a prosperous and peaceful future for Europe. Do we have agency about it? So, and So the means-ends relation is broken in this crisis. So, and this kind of disentangling means-ends relations, of course, is very similar to what Durkheim and Merton described as enemy. And I'm well aware that Durkheim and Merton had somehow different conceptions of enemy. For the sake of this presentation, I will just equate them, but of course there's more to look into there. So what I'm showing you here is descriptions of enemy provided by Merton and Durkheim. And Merton, for example, states that predictability virtually disappears, talks about cultural chaos. Durkheim, on the other side, says that the limits are unknown between the possible and the impossible. So this is clearly very close to what I've just described you of considering crisis as moments of radical uncertainty about the future. So in line with my argument, the future becomes inconceivable and eludes us in a way. So to consider crisis from a perspective of imagined futures, crises very much resemble enemy, or you could say that enemy in a way seems like some kind of sustained crisis. Now, Merton has famously then developed a typology of responses to enemy. So how actors can attempt to cope with enemy. And I would say that this typology, reinterpreted from an imagined future perspective, can help us to make sense of different crisis responses and routes to recovery. So, I mean, for Merton, the situation of my enemy is marked that by that means and ends are no longer aligned. So means usually are not accessible for individuals. So means and ends are disentangled. And I would argue that in the episode of crisis, similarly, means and ends of both can become contested. And then for Merton, individuals have like two possibilities. They can either maintain these means and ends, they can reject them, or they can revise them. And this, if you apply it to means and ends, then leads to a typology of crisis, of responses to enemy from Merton. But we can also use it as a typology of responses to crisis. And here I just want to focus on the responses to crisis that lead to recovery, so the different routes to recovery. And I mean, very basically, to overcome crisis/anomaly, new means-ends relations need to be established. Convincing new means-ends relations need to be established. And this establishment or re-establishment of means-ends relation, of collective modes of projecting, can happen in four basic types. So again, you see sort of these signs refer to whether means and ends are maintained or whether they are revised. So we have a complete means-ends relation again. And I mean, the first one I'm showing you here is conformity. So that basically means that you return to previous collective futures. Both old ends and old means are maintained. So this is something which is more like forgetting the crisis, returning to the same collective futures you had before, which is not always possible, but is one mode. The second route to recovery is readjustment. So here you're adapting expectations to the new situation. So referring back to the collective future that I've just talked about, you would say, you know, doing trade with Russia, having trade relations with Russia will maybe not ensure peace and prosperity in Europe, but it might at least at least keep us from having the Third World War or something like that. So it's readjusting your ends, but keeping the same needs. Then the third one is innovation, which means that you have to come up with new means. You keep the same ends, but you have new means. So I think that's very much what's currently being discussed. So you have to invent new means. I mean, how do we come to a situation where we have peace and prosperity in Europe? So you try to find new means. And then there's the last one, which is revolution, which is you make up entirely a new future with new means and new ends. For the geopolitical crisis we have, I cannot tell you what this would be, an entirely new world order or something like that. But that's the basic idea, that revolution would be you have new means and new ends, so something entirely new. And of course, some of these routes to recovery are more fragile than others. For example, revolution can easily end up in utopism, in experiments, or retreatism, which means no means and ends are available at all. Now, these four routes to recovery of establishing new means and ends relations, I think they are a starting point, a conceptual starting point to help us distinguish these different routes, to help us also distinguish, this route of forgetting crisis versus different modes of where crisis promotes change. But what I think they are important for is that they might allow us to systematically explore conditions that enable or restrain recovery. And this will be the next step, which I cannot do in the presentation today, but just to give you an idea. I mean, if we think of crisis in this sense and responses to crisis in this sense, of course, what societies need to be able to recover from crisis are cultural repertoires of means and ends, of new means and ends. And what societies as well need is a sense of collective agency that can relate these means and ends. And I would argue that under conditions of neoliberalism, both these cultural repertoires and a sense of collective agency have become quite problematic. But I mean, this would be a further route to go, how to look at this then also in an empirical crisis. And for the time being, I would propose this as a conceptual approach to understand crisis, recovery, and the possibility of change. Because I'm quite sure that, sociologists, for some time, we need to engage still with crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. With minutes to spare, 29 seconds to spare.
Wow.
Now we have the third presentation.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present here, especially presenting remotely. I would love to be with you all in person, but I'm in this awkward limbo between PhD submission and postdoc, so I didn't get any funding from any institution to come to Amsterdam in person. So thank you so much for having me here remotely. I'll be presenting on a paper I'm currently calling Avoiding Catastrophes, but after Lisa's presentation, I could possibly rewrite it and call it Avoiding Crises. Let's see. For now, I will present on the current version of the paper. And what is it about? It's about how finance governs its relationship with climate change. Over the past 10 years or so, central banks, the new masters of the universe, have come to think about climate change as something that matters for finance. And they've mostly come to understand climate change in terms of risks. They've coined the term climate risk, and under this umbrella term, they're currently thinking about two main types of risks. On the one hand, physical risk. So for instance, a flood could hit some real estate assets which lose value. Droughts could hit agricultural assets that lose value. And then there's also transition risks. So risks arising from the transition towards a lower carbon economy. So classic cases or classic example is climate policies turning fossil fuel assets into stranded assets. Now, what central banks have quite quickly come to understand is that their backward-looking risk analysis tools don't quite fit the nature of climate change as something inherently non-linear, as these climate stripes here. These are the climate stripes for not for Amsterdam, unfortunately, but for the Netherlands as a whole. Kind of illustrate. Yeah, it's a non-linear thing, so we need to analyze risk in a forward-looking manner. So central banks came together in the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, a club of central banks and financial supervisors, and they created climate scenarios, reference scenarios to facilitate this forward-looking climate risk analysis. So what my paper tries to get at is how these scenarios were designed. And I understand this design process as imagination of futures, and I conceptualize it as translation in the actor network theory kind of sense. And that leads me to the contributions, what my paper wants to really contribute to the literature. On the empirical side, I think that these reference scenarios are a crucial case study to understand how finance and climate change, the climate system relate, how finance organizes and governs its relationship with climate. On the conceptual side, there's really sprawling emergent literature in different fields on imagining futures, in economic sociology, organization studies, science and technology studies, political science, and I argue they lack a kind of coherent conceptualization that can kind of connect these different literatures of how the process of imagination actually works. So not necessarily the projection process, but the imagination process, really, to make the future you can then project or you can then bring into the present. So the paper proposes that this conceptualization could be translation, and I can hopefully demonstrate with my case study that there's some value to it. So what I did methodologically, I interviewed those central bankers and modelers and climate scientists involved in the design process. I conducted 25 semi-structured interviews that covered nearly everyone. There were 2 key people in the design process that I didn't get to interview, but apart from that, I covered pretty much everyone involved in the process. I observed some workshops and webinars around the design process. And I analyzed publicly available documents, conducted thematic analysis in an empathetic and semantic way, and did inductive coding. So the limitations of that are, I didn't directly observe the design process. I did not trace any of the design process that preceded the engagement of central bankers. Obviously, there's a whole climate modeling space very much preceding central banks entering that space. And I'm also not accounting for the linguistic and emotional layers of my research object. So what am I actually talking about? What are these scenarios? The NGFS approached the design of the reference scenarios in a very established way. They mapped the main 2 risk drivers, physical risk and transition risk, as I introduced before, and created a 2x2 matrix. So from low to high physical risk and from low to high transition risk here in the y-axis. And each gray circle that you see here is one scenario. So the NGFS designed 6 scenarios. And one of my key findings already kind of jumps into your face just looking at this illustration here, which is there's no scenario in the upper right quadrant, right? In the high physical, high transition risk quadrant. And obviously, it is all a bit more complicated than that, but it really illustrates quite well that the NGFS reference scenarios avoid the imagination of catastrophic futures, which could potentially hamper their role in preventing or anticipating actual catastrophes. As I said, this imagination process I conceptualized as translation in the actor network theory kind of sense. So let's see how this avoidance of imagining catastrophe actually happened, and what caused it in that translation process. And what I found in my data is I found 4 kind of bottlenecks in the translation process, what Latour and Calon call obligatory passage points. And these 4 obligatory passage points introduce imperatives into this imagination process that can explain the avoidance of catastrophes. So let me quickly walk you through these obligatory passage points. The first one is quite trivial. Obviously, central bankers had to be happy with the scenarios, right? And they introduced what I call reputational imperatives. So central banks, on the one hand, wanted to appear active on both climate change and climate risk. So they needed to do something. They needed to make decisions and spring into action. At the same time, one of the key sources of legitimacy for central banks is expertise and neutrality. So they needed to maintain an image of expertise and neutrality in that process. Now, unfortunately, central bankers have no expertise at all in the climate change space. So what they did then was to recruit the most legitimate, the most highly regarded models and modeling teams in that space that also supply the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with climate scenarios. Now, these models in turn introduce something I call technical imperatives. What does that mean? So one example is that these models only allow one way, or a very narrow way, to imagine ambitious climate futures, for instance, a 1.5 degree scenario. And the only way is to get there via technological innovation. So imagining technologies that do not yet exist, but might exist in the future. Technologies that suck carbon out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere. And it does actively resist, these models actively resist imaginations of, for instance, consumption limitation, degrowth, for instance. Now, models do not run by themselves, right? They have to be run and maintained by scientists. And these scientists also introduced new imperatives, what I call professional imperatives. They're professional norms of not appearing as being speculating anyway, not making political decisions or judgment calls, but basing decisions on empirical data and robust theory. That also very much affected how they could imagine futures. For instance, when they had to calculate national decarbonization pathways, what they did was they based these pathways on empirical data. So on the past, they extrapolated the past, continued a status quo, and therefore avoided an imagination, for instance, more just ideas of how decarbonization burdens could be distributed, especially between the global north and the global south. They also really wanted to avoid in any way appearing to be non-robust in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of the decisions. For instance, there's a thing called damage functions that calculates how much physical climate change impacts create in terms of economic damages. And everyone agreed that one particular damage function definitely provided values that were too low. They were definitely too low. But this damage function was the one that was theoretically most sound. So scientists were reluctant to use any other damage function, even though they knew the outputs were too low and incorrect. They also were reluctant to introduce any kind of aspects of physical reality into the scenarios where there was too much uncertainty to provide any definite values. For instance, sea level rise is not in these scenarios because there's too much uncertainty around the distinct values. Climate tipping points, same thing. Now, lastly, the last obligatory passage point, obviously the scenarios also had to be usable in practice in financial institutions. So they had to provide useful and usable outputs for the established risk management routines in financial institutions. which means that extreme values, which would imply the default of whole industries, risk managers couldn't really do anything with it. They didn't know what implications to draw from that because there was so much outside of their routines of risk management, which is why these kind of scenarios were excluded. They also couldn't really deal with wide uncertainty margins. Yeah, they couldn't have an indicator and then 100 different values for one single indicator. They needed one distinct number per indicator, which is why uncertainty margins and aspects of scenarios like sea level rise, where only uncertainty margins could be provided, didn't make it into the final scenarios. So to conclude, these obligatory passage points created exclusionary dynamics in the process of imagining futures, and therefore excluded, for instance, imaginations of just futures of relevant physical hazards, alternative to unlimited GDP growth for everyone, and thus excluded the imagination of different kinds of catastrophes. So what I hope has become obvious from this presentation is that this imagination of futures, therefore, is a clear act of ontological politics. And I argue that an academic theory approach, a translation approach, really helps to unpack, to make visible these ontological politics that need to be problematized. And that hopefully, based on this problematization, we can also identify points of choice to then make this problematization the basis for the imagination of alternative futures, whether that's catastrophic futures to do some, for instance, actual climate stress testing, or utopian futures. Thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to your questions and your feedback. Thank you very much.
Wow. That's really welcome. Excellent to have a shorter talk so that we recover our late start with more time. So I say we go now to just questions, and the floor is open.
I have a question to Lisa. It was a great presentation, very Mertonian. So similar critique as to structural functionalism, I would say, because when you are saying about epistemological uncertainty, it's always a cognition of someone, yes, which is uncertain. And as Merton was criticized for expanding the point of view of dominant groups in American society of what's going on. Here I would say that, and coming back from your example, illustration, yes, the end is the peace and prosperity in Europe, and the mean is the trade relations with Russia. So as me coming from Eastern Europe, I would say that many people in our region were saying nothing good is be a consequence of normalizing the relations with Russia earlier. So this brings the critique that maybe perceiving these relations between means and ends are from the perspective of someone who is dominant in a certain setting, and the crisis then is still an opportunity. Yeah, the anomaly is perceived by the ones who are dominant and were having some kind of a it was for their privilege, the situation, which was not shaken. And then thanks to the crisis, our marginalized views about how the reality should be organized, thankfully, are again on the table and are perceived as something still legitimate. I hope that my point was.
So let's take Jose Maria and then
so one is for first one is for Lisa. So if I understand correctly, all of these concepts and ideas are geared toward understanding people's personal experience of uncertainty, right? the idea of autonomy, I think, wouldn't really apply for another kind of an organization level. But I think it should be, there must be something similar that applies to the organization level that would be very interesting to understand. And your presentation made me think of the book on the work of Lee Clark on fantasy documents, and how, which is more about how organizations come up with these inventions of plans to deal with crises like nuclear accidents. I really rings a bell with the notion that some of these ends and means creations and recreations might actually be even detached from the crisis, right? It's not about solving a crisis, it's just about having a notion of this coherence between ends and means. Would that be a right understanding? Like, this is not about the actual crisis, but about simply the view that we have to the world. And then a very a small comment to Matthias. I think it's very important to point this quadrant that is empty. And just before in the previous session, I was mentioning the word of ghost scenarios. So scenarios that we know are there, but we don't talk about, they don't appear. A ghost scenario in the work of Rafael Ramirez and the scenario making. But there's also the term of feral scenarios, which are these scenarios that kind of go wild, and we don't like to represent them because they show all of the things that could go wrong. I think it's really, I can send you the documents so that you can actually talk up more about those as critical missing components of what the NGCF is doing.
Okay, so then the last question.
Yeah, I'd also ask Lisa something. I really love the idea of bringing enemy back again a little more, because I really like the concept, and I think it's very, very helpful if people keep underestimating it. I'm totally on your side with that. My question was two questions more. Well, the most important question would be, how would you imagine these 4 different ways of recovering come to be? Because unless I know more about it, and I guess you have something on your mind, they sound very functional to me, because they are the ways to receive or to achieve recovery, but that kind of leaves the mechanism how they may come to be out. The alternative would be that this is the way that you've kind of framed it when you explained it, would be that people reflexively decide, let's choose a path to recovery. And I think this happens, but it doesn't happen as often as collectives actually recover. So it's just one among many mechanisms by which recovery can be achieved. That would be interesting. What your next thought would be on this.
So
thanks.
I see that Anne is raising her hand.
Yeah, I think we'll have a round of answers and then another round of questions.
Okay, I will try to be brief. I mean, I think part of the answer to this, whether it's perspective of privilege, and also I think to your question, partly it relates as well to whether it's about the actual crisis, about views of the world that we have. So what I should say is that I think that crisis in itself is of course a construct, right? So I mean, or at least a combination of sometimes tangible disruptions and the way we make sense of the world. So I mean, crisis, it's a political struggle about whether something is a crisis or not, and there of course privilege comes in, privileged perspectives comes in. And I mean, there is the saying that, you know, crisis is when bad things happen to privileged people, because crisis is when collectively shared means-ends relations are disentangled, but I mean, who decides what are collective? I mean, there's people who have more of a say what are collectively held means-ends relations about the future. Not everyone has the same say in the future, right? And so I would consider crisis also as something that is largely constructed and discursively, I mean, needs to be constructed discursively. And therefore, I mean, of course, it involves the views of the world that we have, or new views of the world that we would like to establish. And I mean, you referred also to this issue that, you know, Merton and Schutz as well actually referred to the personal level, and that's entirely true. I mean, they both thought about imagining the future on a personal level, because I mean, that's something that Anne particularly pointed out, especially, I mean, Schutz was very skeptic of collectively imagining the future, of ideology, etc. So that's why, you know, I mean, I focused on sort of the individual level. But I think that collectively imagining the future, nevertheless, is important, particularly because it also orients individual imaginaries of the future. And that might then relate a bit to your question about recovery, which is, I see the trouble here. I mean, what I'm not saying is, you know, these are 4 ways in which recovery as such comes about, because that recovery can come about is a complex thing, right? I'm more talking about, you know, I think that for recovery to come about, there needs to be renewed collective imaginaries of the future. And these are 4 molds which just can be done. And I mean, the first one, conformity, basically can just be that, you know, in the tangible world, the source of crisis is gone, and then you can just return to what you always believed. So this does not necessarily have to be like, you know, thinking of, you know, what are the 4 different modes, where we go. But I think, it's an analytical perspective to say, you know, how are these new imaginaries of the future, these re-established imaginaries of the future, how do they come about? That's one way. So it's not, I mean, if you have a new imaginary of the future, that doesn't mean that, you know, this kind of recovery then really comes about, but it's the first step, a necessary step.
So, Matthias, did you want to respond to Jose Maria, or is that just an informational pass along? Wasn't really a question?
Yeah, I think we'll catch up after conference and have a longer chat. That would be great. So yeah, I'm happy to have more questions.
Great, you know, really exciting and fascinating set of papers. So I'm really glad I was able to hear these. I have just a couple of questions for each of you. First of all, Thomas, really interesting analysis. I was wondering if you could take like the theorization of time and temporality a little bit further, because it seems that you've got this interesting thing going on where there's a kind of a split temporality in the organization. I can't remember the name of the organization that you were focusing on in Belfast. In which crisis creates a kind of a short-term opportunity for energetic and opportunistic action, while also taking the long view. So it's interesting to kind of to think about how an organization or a collectivity can hold 2, or multiple, but at least in this case, like two kinds of temporalities, like in their action, in their minds and in their action simultaneously. So that might be a way to actually kind of deepen and expand the way that you're imagining or you're theorizing how time is working in the action of this organization in Belfast. Lisa, I love a lot of what you're doing here. So I just wanted to explore, one point. I like the way you're going into the means and relationship, and I especially appreciate the revisiting of Merton, who I think is really undervalued, especially the anomie essay, and the way that I think it helps us think about inequality and exclusion in interesting ways. But I'm wondering, like, you characterize the means to end relationship as instrumental, and I'm wondering if that's the best way to think about that. So in that the means to end relationships is also infused with values. That's kind of what we get from pragmatism, but also, it's what we get from Parsons, or Merton. When Parsons talks about the normative orientation as part of the Unit Act, or Merton talks about cultural goals, and institutionalized means, the fusing of of values and ends. It doesn't eclipse the ends, in which some kinds of neo-pragmatist interpretations are just kind of collapsing the focus on ends. But sees the means and relationships as a back and forth between objectives, projections, and the ways in which people are kind of wrestling with values. And then I had a question that occurred to me at the end. What is it harder to do? Is it harder to rethink ends or to rethink means? So, utopias are rethinking ends, but not paying a lot of attention to pathways. Technocracy is kind of disassociating the rethinking of ends from, political engagement. I'm just wondering, what would you expect? When would you expect more of an engagement in the rethinking of means versus the rethinking of ends, as something to develop as you go into your typology? And Matthias, a lot of really interesting things here. I'm fascinated by the way you are documenting the avoidance of catastrophic scenarios. I saw I'm looking at more narrative scenarios constructed by civil society organizations, and in some cases I see almost the opposite, is that they have the hard time coming up with the transformative scenarios, and so those have to become added sometimes almost as an afterthought with that, because it's almost easier to think through the catastrophe and the growth scenarios. It's harder to think through the transformation scenario. So it's interesting to hear you go through the organizational, the technical, and the interest orientations. These translation points are really fascinating. I'm wondering if the process of scenario construction was completely understood as being technical, and if there was a narrative component to how they understood within this corporate context, the way that they understand the construction of scenarios. Just given that narrativity was really important to, let's say, Shell or the Shell scenarios. So how do they see the interplay between the technical, the quantitative, and the narrative or the more interpretive component of envisioning the climate futures?
So, yes.
Yeah, two comments. One to Lisa and one to Matthias. Lisa, I think this is fascinating. What you're trying to have two small comments. One is you rely very heavily on Schütz, and I always thought that Schütz is helpful, but Dewey and pragmatism, might actually resolve some of the issues of individualism that you have in a phenomenological approach, and I would recommend to go stronger into pragmatism. The other one is it might look a little nitty-gritty, but it may also be conceptually relevant. You're saying the crisis is a moment in which the future becomes radically uncertain, and I always thought a crisis is a situation in which expectations fail, or in which you don't trust in expectations anymore. I would somehow, I think, stay with this expectations. You can imagine a situation which is uncertain, highly uncertain, but where actors still believe that they think they know what needs to be done, and that the situation in this sense is not experienced as a crisis, but a situation in which, in a way, you don't know anymore, what you can do and what effects it will have what you do. So it's more the subjective side here, which actually constitutes a crisis. I don't know, but I think that would probably need some more thinking, and might be important. This regard to Matthias, which I also liked a lot, and there is here at SASE a very fascinating mini conference going on political economy of climate crisis. I've been to some of these sessions, and this paper would have fit also excellently actually into into this. So the question, what I missed a little bit in your presentation is the whole notion of power and interest. It seems to be an almost just an epistemological problem. Yeah, that these banks see certain things but don't see others. And I would like to have an analysis which brings into focus a little bit more, issues of interest and power and how they play into what they see and what they don't see. Okay. Yeah.
I just have a few comments. So for Thomas' paper, there is a bit of literature on how crisis helps or triggers autonomization of certain actors. And I noticed that at the end, but you did not have the time to develop your thoughts on how there is this it triggered some of like perspectives of autonomization. I was thinking that whether you can tell about how does it occur in relation with Lisa's paper, because I understand like the idea of anomy, but there is also this idea of, I think they fit together, that these crises are also exploited or they are sometimes initiated, and how that, I mean, we were talking initially about this dark side of crisis when you have these actors, and I think especially where, for example, if you are looking, because we are living in a context when you have this, we are socialized to this crisis. So certain political actors, you can see that, so the crisis is like, it creates some anomy, but now I think certain groups of people are getting more skilled to react to this crisis. So whether you're taking this into account, this also, there is anomy, but on the other hand, there is also expectations of crisis, initiation, you know, because you were referring to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was, very often it was said that Putin had this strategic failure, so that he sort of initiated the crisis, but it didn't go. So can you maybe also include in this discussion of means and ends also this much more like strategically induced, like, you know, so it's not anomy, but it's more like strategic playing, like these players of this crisis. I liked very much the presentation of Matthias on there is this need to look much more closely in how these imaginaries are constructed. And I was thinking maybe you could theoretically tell us a bit, what does actor network theory help us? So I understand that it makes much more obvious that it is a politics of, that people think strategically about how they imagine the futures, but what elements, for example, actor network theory does not show? For example, the emotions. So there are a lot of elements in imaginaries of crisis which we have problems, I think, theoretically to capture. So there is this idea of fear mongering, so that people are socialized into these emotions of fear. So can you tell us maybe more about how actor network theory, what can it show, but what the theory misses?
Okay, no more questions. We answer the questions and then we're done. And, you know, luxuriate in your answers, but it's between you and lunch. So let's go in Thomas and then Lisa and then Matthias, okay?
Okay, do I need to, can I just speak here? Can you hear me?
You're being recorded.
Okay, can you hear me, Anne? Perfect, thank you. No, thanks so much for a comment there. I think I would, if you have any sort of references or literature to read in terms of time studies, I'd really value that. I work in a management school, but I have an economic geography background, and I know sort of time geographies was a area of study that may be worth engaging with. I think you're absolutely right with this sort of temporal aspect of the main group I was looking at, and you know, the sort of conflicting nature of what they're trying to do, I think is at the heart of some of the dilemmas there in the sort of this group sort of reflects a sort of longer term trajectory of fighting the state and contesting the state space of Northern Ireland. But you're right, there's also this sort of short term opportunity that this group is grabbing. They're really showing that they have there's a utility to their social capital and that they are helping avert a crisis at the time of COVID, and they managed to secure more funding in a more sort of ostensible, visible role in helping the labour market cohere. And I think that is a big part of the kind of paradox here. When I looked at other groups from sort of say a British Protestant community, there wasn't nearly as many sort of conflicting objectives there. I think one of the slogans from a certain unionist group was no surrender to COVID-19. It was very much just carrying on in the same kind of aggressive mantra, whereas this is much more that there's a lot more kind of political possibilities from this longer term trend there. And I think I have to kind of, I don't know if it's this paper, but there's certainly another paper trying to work through the complexities of that, the time aspect that you're talking about and the different opportunities. The other question, I'd probably benefit speaking to you at the break briefly about that. So, well,
Okay.
is that okay? And I'll let people talk now.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Well, thanks a lot for these really good questions. I mean, and yeah, I completely understand that sort of this framing this instrumental might be misleading in many ways, because it sort of speaks very because of rational choice interpretation of needs. And so what I meant by it somehow is that these are imaginaries of the future that, I mean, I call them also agentic. So this is about, being able to shape the future, to do something about the future, that the future, so it's different from the future being a destiny or just being a forecast or just a hope, which does not involve this, you can do something about the future. But this involves, of course, this normative perspective that you referred to. So this normative perspective is really entangled in that. And I would absolutely think of a back and forth between means and ends. And they also, what is a means, what is an, what are ends? This, I mean, empirically, this is so hard to disentangle, and I think it cannot be, but it's a way of thinking about, that, there are steps that we can take to get somewhere. And this maybe also somehow relates already to what Jens said about Dewey, this ends in view thing that Dewey talks about. I mean, in the long version of this paper, I draw much more on Dewey, and I think Anne has done a tremendous job in her last recent paper or chapter where she brings together Schütze and Dewey. So, but yes, I think I already draw on Dewey as well, which was not explicit here, but I think it's important. And and also ask, what is harder to revise, means or ends? And I mean, intuitively, I would say means, because ends are so embedded in value in a way. But then again, what are means and ends? It's so hard to disentangle. Like growth, is that a means in itself for something, for social integration, for a prosperous world or so on? Or is it an end in itself that we attach value to? And I mean, many people will find it hard to depart from growth also as a means, because it's also, an end in itself. So I think that's a very good and valid question, but I cannot answer it like that. And Aliana, what you said about this induced crisis, I think definitely there's a politics of crisis, right? Of what is interpreted as crisis and so on. But of course, then actors might have interests that a crisis occurs, and that I'm not so much relating actually to like say starting a war or something like that, but also interpreting a situation as crisis and what kind of crisis. So I mean, are we now in an energy crisis, and what can be solutions to it? Is it sort of going back to our own gas and oil or whatever? So there is definitely this. There can be interests that want to have a crisis, either also to conserve and maintain the previous order, or to bring about something new. So it's not that crisis always brings about something new. And sort of having a crisis can also be a mode of repression and of conserving the order that there is. So I don't know if that entirely answered your questions, but I think it relates to it. Thanks a lot. Very good questions.
So, Matthias.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be quick and really excellent sets of questions. Thank you very much. So the relation between the technical and the narrative component of the scenarios, really interesting question. Unfortunately, my way of data collection doesn't really give me a lot of access to how the narrative parts were constructed. But what I can see in my data is that this is where lay knowledge becomes mobilized, and this is where politics becomes more explicit. So that's a really interesting part, actually, where it becomes possible to, for instance, say, oh, well, maybe not all countries develop their climate policies perfectly in sync and in motion, and maybe there are actually regional differences. So kind of that lay level of political science understanding kind of soaks into these narratives and allows to shape the technical path dependencies and somewhat alter them. So yeah, really good question. Unfortunately, I still lack a bit of data on that. Omission of interest and power. Yes, I'm trying to get through this concept of ontological politics to kind of really mitigate that problem of A&T. And I would say there are two levels of interest. That's a crude analogy, but there are the interests of, central banks want to maintain their image of expertise and scientists as well. So there's this kind of level of interest that I think I cover quite well. And then there's the level of kind of the more material macroeconomic interests that I think you might be alluding to. And I take your point, and I need to tease out more clearly how these relate, but there is definitely a clear link for how certain economic systems are being privileged in these scenarios, how the global south is structurally disadvantaged in many different ways through the imagination of these scenarios. So I think I can conceptually get to this level as well, but I take your point that I need to do more work on that. So thank you. And lastly, what can A&T do? What can it not do? Really good question. A&T comes from that engineering workshop and scientific laboratory space. It doesn't work in every space. I think in this finance space is that it does a lot of good work because it helps us to go down into the layer of actual macroeconomic modeling components, climate modeling components, unpacking the actual maths behind it. So really getting to the materiality, the material aspect of the world, and teasing out how it shapes our imaginations of futures. I think it can do that very well. It definitely, I think, lacks a micro-conceptualization of the self. And with that comes, which is kind of ironic because INT is such a micro thing, but it lacks a conceptualization of the self, I think. So it doesn't account for emotions, which you flag might be really important in other spaces outside of finance, maybe. Thank you very much for all these questions. Really, really helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for a very productive session. We have the next session is 2:45 on more possibility, and I think we have COVID and expertise and possibility in the paper. Yes. 2:45. So thank you very much. We actually were good on time. We started late because of the technical glitches, but we did a good job of keeping with it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.